First up is a new film called Novocaine, and I think this movie is a great example of the importance of casting. And I mean that in a good way. So the premise of the film is that there's this character named Nathan Kane. He's just an average, everyman, like regular dude. He works in a bank, but he cannot feel pain. And it's set in a relatively grounded world. So, like, he's not supposed to be a superhero. He's not a vigilante. In fact, it is theoretically dangerous to him because they use this example, not a huge spoiler, but he drinks all his foods as liquid because if he were to accidentally swallow something and, like, cut off the tip of his tongue, he could choke and he wouldn't feel the pain of cutting off the tip of his tongue. And I think, okay, potentially interesting concept. Let's see what they do with it. And I think the value and power of this movie is Jack Quaid as Nathan Kane. He is so lovably charming and has a great sense of comedic timing, but also sells the horror of the situations that this character eventually gets pulled into. So again, he's just an average everyman, and then, to quote the logline, the girl of his dreams, played by Amber Midthunder, gets kidnapped, and he goes to unexpected lengths in order to try and save her. And speaking of casting, if you did not know that Amber Midthunder was the woman from Prey, and then you saw Prey after having seen this, you would be so confused, and you'd be like, this is not the same human being. But she plays this light, bubbly, again, charismatic character in this, and I think in the hands of a lesser actress, this all would fall apart because so much of this is dependent on the dynamic between the two of them. They have to sell this extreme condition of his combined with these really absurd scenarios. So this film does sort of become one of those movies where they're like, how ridiculous of a pain situation can we get this character into because he doesn't feel pain without making it so unbelievable that you'd be like, well, he should be dead immediately because while he doesn't feel pain, he does bleed, you know? And so the movie moves along pretty quickly. The plot is as I described, so it's not the most complex thing, but are you going to see Novocaine for the most complex plot? No, you're not. It also stars Ray Nicholson, Betty Gabriel, Matt Walsh, and Jacob Batalon. And like I said, this could have been a disaster. If you didn't have the right players in place, this would have been terrible. It would have been hokey and cheesy, and potentially hokey and cheesy and not an enjoyable campish way, just hokey and cheesy. But because Jack Quaid is selling this with an extreme amount of earnestness, like I said, the comedic timing is such an important part of this, because without the comedy, this becomes more like something like The Monkey, which just felt like an extreme snuff film, where this doesn't go so far as, you know, they're like trying to murder people in different scenarios, but they are effectively trying to hurt their protagonists perpetually. And so you have to want him to survive and you want him to be okay because otherwise you're not invested. So Novocaine, I wasn't expecting to enjoy it as much as I did. The rewatch value for me personally, I was super grossed out and squeamish about a lot of the parts of it because they do intentionally take joy in the extremities of the situations. And so I think this will be for a lot of people. I think if you are like me and do tend to rank on the more squeamish side, you will survive it. It is not as bad as a lot of the things out there, but I was invited to watch it again. I was like, I think I'm okay. I don't know if I can physically watch this again. First time, great level of shock value. There were lots of people like reacting in a theater, and I think this is one of those movies that does benefit from a shared experience. And you go, ooh, and oh my God, together. But it is not a perfect film by any means. Again, the plot is very thin, and I do think there are times when maybe they could have tempered what they were going for with the extreme physical situations. But overall, I had a pretty good time, and so I'm going to give it a 3.9 out of 5. The next film I have is called Borderline, which effectively makes this week a Ray Nicholson double feature. And by the way, Ray Nicholson, son of Jack Nicholson, if you weren't aware. So it stars Ray Nicholson, Samara Weaving, Jimmy Fails, Alba Baptista, and Eric Dane. And Ray Nicholson plays basically a character who is a stalker and delusional, who is obsessed with this fictional 90s pop superstar, played by Samara Weaving. You know, she kind of feels like a combo of like Madonna meets Pam Anderson meets many of the superstars of that day. But there are specific things from her storyline that I was like, oh, okay, I see who you're pulling from here. And again, this is one of those films where I'm like, this is a good example of the importance of casting because Ray Nicholson has to play a character who is effectively unhinged, but has to be charismatic and or charming enough that we aren't completely repulsed by him every time he's on screen because he is committing basically heinous acts. The film centers around the culmination of his mania and obsession with her, and he is delusional and convinced that they are going to get married, and so it's basically him trying to force a wedding and breaking into her house and all the things that ensue because of that. In some ways, this feels like a very contained film. You know, there aren't that many locations. It takes place in a mansion, so, you know, it's not like there wasn't wasn't a set. And I want to be clear, there's a distinction between being cheap and being efficient with your budget. And this is one that is efficient with its budget because you can tell they spent money on at least the location and obviously on the talent. But it manages to be really clever with the space it has. And there's some like interesting editing stuff. The funny thing is, I don't know if it's a funny thing, but so this is directed and written by the person who wrote Cocaine Bear. And when the trailer rolls, it's billed as, from the producers of Barbie and Saltburn and from the writer of Cocaine Bear. And I was like, what am I in for here? But I actually think it worked really well. Again, it is like Novocaine in some senses where it does delight in the kind of physical thriller horror parts of it. It can get gory and gross. So like Novocaine, if you are, not comfortable and squeamish about those things, which is perfectly valid, this movie is not going to be for you. It is not as terrifying as I thought it was going to be in a good way, because I don't like horror films. And I was prepared for this to be like, he was going to torture her and do all these horrible things. And hopefully it's not a huge spoiler. He doesn't torture her, but that's a good thing, right? That makes it palatable. I don't want to go into spoilers, but there are some things I'm like, this is a fine line of, is this being offensive? I don't think so. I didn't walk away being like, oh, I don't know. But there are moments where it definitely could have dipped into that. So they definitely flirt with things that are questionable. But I think at the end of the day, they managed to make it out pretty clean. I was much more amused by this film and like entertained than I was expecting to be. Obviously, I went in with zero expectations because I didn't know anything about it. I was pleasantly surprised by it. I think it has a sense of irreverence, and it feels like they probably had a decent time making the film, which you can feel translate on screen. I am going to give this a 3.6 out of 5. The next film I have is called The Electric State, and it's out streaming on Netflix. And I don't even know if this is one of those ones where I can talk about casting. This is one of those ones where I can talk about some people need to be stopped. So this film is from the Russo brothers. This is not their first Netflix original film. And we have reached the point where every time I see from the Russo brothers and Netflix, I now feel a sense of dread. And that's not a good place to be. So The Electric State takes place in the 90s, much like Borderline. It's in a sort of alternate future. And the idea is that robots are invented and then they have souls, ? And then they stop wanting to do the jobs that they're assigned to do. And then there's a war between robots and humanity. Millie Bobby Brown plays a girl, a woman. She is an orphan. She had a brother who was a genius. He passes away, but then maybe comes back in the form of a robot. This is in the trailers. I'm not giving anything away. It already sounds absurd. I am aware. And then she needs to get to this sort of clandestine robot sanctuary or no man's land or no robots land. I guess no man's land because it's only for robots. And she ends up enlisting the help of Chris Pratt, who is playing action Chris Pratt, which he pretty much plays in every single film of his. And then they have to take down the man in this dystopian future they live in. It also has Ke Huy Quan, Giancarlo Esposito, Stanley Tucci. It has the voices of folks like Anthony Mackie, Woody Harrelson, Brian Cox, Jenny Slate, Alan Tudyk, Billy Bob Thornton. And I'm just like, oh, I get so frustrated, the waste of resources. Because this movie, I guess in some senses it is original, but what it actually feels like is just a hodgepodge of a bunch of other concepts that have been explored in a more creative and thoughtful way in other films and media, like books and all that type of stuff. And it's so phoned in and it has no sense of heart. And it was so hard to watch. It was 2 hours and 8 minutes. And I was snails pacing through. And I'm just like, at a certain point, I was like, how are there 45 minutes left? Because it is so telegraphed what's going to happen through the course of it, which is fine. Sometimes with a movie like this, you're like, look, I want the comfort of having a sense of where it's going. But it is so just like paint by numbers, by rote action film. I've had to ask myself this of late. I'm like, is Millie Bobby Brown a good actress? I think some of it is the projects she's taking, where she just keeps playing very similar roles, right? And a lot of these are these Netflix projects, like the Enola Holmes and Damsel and The Electric State, where I'm like, maybe we break out of this. Maybe we try something very different. Be in like a super horror film or be in like a slapstick comedy. But I don't know what it is about these direct to streaming, but blockbuster, and I'm putting that in aggressive air quotes, films, that it continues to fail to resonate. The only one of these types of films so far that I have seen that I've been like, yeah, this was great, and I actually think I would have wanted to see this in a theater, was The Old Guard back in 2020. But since then, I feel like every time I see one of these, I'm just like, I dread it. Because you have all these talented people, you have the Russo brothers, and if I think about their career, obviously you have their involvement in the Marvel Universe, but they have done and worked on some stuff that I love, and you're just like, what, the Russo brothers did that? Like, they have directed on Arrested Development and Communities and happy endings. And I'm like, oh man, like you can do stuff that is really clever and intricate comedy-wise, and there's even action and all this stuff. What happened? Like, is this a scenario where like too much money and power and nobody saying no to you has diluted your creativity? Like, I'm so frustrated by it. Please don't watch this movie. It's very bad. I'm sorry. There wasn't a single chuckle in it. If you're like a huge Chris Pratt fan, I just watch Guardians because this is basically Peter Quill light. If you're a huge Millie Bobby Brown fan, please just watch Stranger Things because I think that is her best performances to date. If you want to explore the idea of whether or not robots have sentience and can be considered creatures, please watch Measure of a Man from Star Trek The Next Generation, or even something like I, Robot. If you want to watch something about also, I didn't even mention, but there's this whole like, I don't know, technology where you can basically like split your brain power, and so you can be living in like a VR reality, but also controlling it's not a robot, it's like a drone shell to do the tasks you don't want to do, which gave me a little bit of Severance vibes, but it also made me think of WALL-E. I was like, just watch WALL-E. Honestly, so much better than this. There are so many better things you can watch than The Electric State. If you want to watch a thing about a bunch of characters and some of them are like owned IPs coming together and in some sort of uprising, watch Ready Player One. I have just named so many projects that you could watch instead of The Electric State, that The Electric State is borrowing from, but not paying homage to. It is just like, I don't know, this seemed to work for these folks. Let's just try that out. Not for me in any way, shape, or form. Again, I know movies are hard to make, but I also know when you're Russo brothers, you get resources that other filmmakers don't, and yet this is the type of project you spit out that's devoid of joy or creativity or investment. I'm frustrated by that. I'm going to give this a 1.4 out of 5, and that feels generous. The last thing I have this week is a new series that has started streaming on Apple TV+. It is called Dope Thief. It stars Brian Tyree Henry, Wagner Moura, Marin Ireland. It has Kate Mulgrew, Ving Rhames, Dustin Nguyen, and it is also executive produced by Ridley Scott. And I'm going to fully acknowledge, I struggled a little bit with the first episode of this. So it is about two friends who are maybe on the questionable side of the law, they're criminals, and they pose as DEA agents in order to rob some drug dealers. And then they get embroiled in a much larger web of crime than they intended to. So the first episode, a lot of screamy, yelly acting, which I found a little tense. But then after that, I was in. So slow start, really gets invested later in the season. And by the end of it, you're like, oh my God, what is happening here? Again, the biggest note I have through the course of the series is the modulation of the like tense moments where suddenly they come in like really hot and you're like, it's very uneven. It's a roller coaster ride, but it's like a drop roller coaster, but then you don't know when the drop is coming, I guess is the best way I could describe it. But I do think it's really well acted. Story-wise, it takes a moment and then it goes all in. If you like a crime thriller, I think is the important thing here. If you don't, the show is not going to be for you. But, I think the friendship between the two leads is also like really messed up, but also really earnest. Like you see true, I would call it love between friends displayed through these characters. And it is something I actually enjoy seeing on screen. Like, I don't know if we get that portrayal of a male friendship in a way where they also don't call it out that often. And I feel like sometimes movies and shows will be like, look at them, they're a healthy example, even though these two guys are criminals and, all these other things. But I think it does a good job of establishing this relationship between them where you're like, yeah, these guys would go to this type of length for each other. Like, I believe in them. So Dope Thief started streaming today. Episodes coming out weekly on Apple TV+. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Like I said, stick with it through the first episode. It takes a moment, but then it gets there.